katoa. Nā mihi kia koutou, nā mihi ki tō whenua, tō maunga, tō awa, nō reira huri noa, tēnā tātou katoa. So, greetings everyone, greetings to your lands, your mountains, your waterways, and your peoples. And greetings to all of us who have assembled here in this space. For me, it's morning, early morning, 8:15, and wherever you are, I greet you, and my land greets you. My mountains greet your mountains. My waterways greet your waterways. And, you know, for the topic that I think you're engaged in around sustainability and that, I think it's good to start with land acknowledgements, deeper than simply the people of the lands, the people who are currently on the lands, but an acknowledgement of Mother Earth, and in a way the crisis that Mother Earth is in at the moment. I think really paying attention to the land and really genuinely kind of engaging with the idea that the land, the mountains, the waterways, the earth, the dirt, everything that grows on that has a kind of agency. And we need to, as human beings, respect that agency, but also understand our role as human beings to take care of and look after Mother Earth and all those creatures that depend on us for their survival. And humans have not done a great job at that. So for many Indigenous peoples, of course, Mother Earth is very much deeply ingrained in our philosophies and the way we think about life, the way we think about humanity, our humanness, and what being human means in terms of an ethic, a way of being, a way of behaving, a way of exercising the powers that humans have, which are enormous. We have the powers to destroy, and that makes it an awesome power that we have to learn how to constrain sometimes, work within other times, but always respect and be humble about. So once again, thank you for the invitation. I'm so sorry I was kind of late. It's always a bit of a panic going into these talks internationally, not quite knowing whether I've got my own technology right. I'm coming to you from a place called Waterloo in the North Island, in the lower part near the capital city in Wellington. This is my husband's territory, and it's a beautiful summer's day. The sky is blue, flowers are all blooming out there, and it's coming to the end. I know the end of February, the weather starts to change. So I understand you have all been working around the ideas of decolonizing methodologies in relation to your fields of sustainability. I don't know where you have got to with that, so I'm just going to summarize, I guess, some of what I think are relevant ideas for you, and really I do it in the spirit of having you think about these things. They're not instructions and directions. I really, my approach to all of this is that firstly we need to be thoughtful, we need to understand the tools and ideas that we're working with, and we need to step carefully. The last thing that our communities and people need really are any kind of do-gooder type researcher doesn't matter what their ideologies and belief systems are, but I think Indigenous peoples and many marginalised peoples are kind of over the idea of people coming in to save them, show them better ways of being and doing things, helping them, but not really helping them, and being blissfully unaware of the power that they actually have. And I know in Canada, there's a great deal of, work that's gone on around First Nations, around ethics. It's been very influential here in New Zealand, Aotearoa, in Australia, and in other parts of the world. The work that particularly First Nation scholars have done around, the ethical principles of reciprocity and relationships. And, those ideas have travelled well. They're really key terms, but when I teach and when I, talk to people in the whole field of decolonization, decolonialism, words really matter. And it's really important to have a deep understanding of the words that we're using, so that when we attach the D part to it, we have a deep understanding of what it is we're asking for. So if we're going to talk about decolonization, we really need to understand colonization. Decolonialism, we really need to understand colonialism. Pardon me. Colonialism to me is, I guess, the part that I've studied, the part that I reckon I'm pretty good at, is understanding colonialism as a knowledge project, as a project that was engaged in epistemology, that was, for the most part, a very violent process against other knowledges, other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding the world and of making sense and making meaning. And the language that was imposed, particularly, in English by the British, but it was also imposed by European powers, generally speaking, who spread themselves far and wide across the southern parts of the globe. It was very much a use of language to obliterate other terms and concepts, to erase them, and to create different sorts of categories of knowing. What we, think about now as classification systems. So most other languages and most Indigenous languages, embedded in the language is a classification system, ways of categorizing knowledge, ways of categorizing or putting into categories those things that matter. And you would know that English is good at binaries, at creating simple oppositional categories. And colonialism really brought that alive. And it started to build these associations between concepts such as, what it means to be civilized and uncivilized, to being savage and civilized. And of course, what the British were good at was kind of lining up all the things they thought they invented as marks of civilization, and then everything else obviously meant uncivilized. So then there were associations around literacy. So if you were literate, it must be even more civilized. But of course, when they went to China and India, who were very, very literate cultures, and the Middle East, all of our cultures are literate in particular ways, but China had paper literacy, had textual literacy on paper, but even they were considered sort of uncivilized because of the language they wrote it in. So language matters, terms matter. And I think if you're going to work in the methodology space, you're going to be writing your dissertations, or, you don't have to be like write really sophisticated, clever things. Use the words that you use well, critically, and understand the power of those words. So when I'm talking about decolonizing methodologies and decolonizing, it's really coming to it with this kind of appreciation, I think, of what it is that we have to actually decolonize, and what does that mean? What does it, do you simply dismantle everything and leave? What gets left if you simply dismantle? Or does it mean untangling, disentangling? Does it mean taking apart, deconstructing? Does it mean reframing? Does it mean building something new? Or does it mean revitalizing what was once there and was destroyed? Does it mean putting things back together again? So, the work of a researcher, you think, well, it's not necessarily our job to, rebuild. It's not our job to necessarily get in there and dismantle these structures. But if we're in the knowledge business, it is our job in terms of knowledge and language and classifications and categories. That is exactly our job, is to understand the first thing we have to, in a way, decolonize the very tools that we've often been trained in to use, to understand, that those tools might have a history to them. And for those of you who are in Canada, one of colonialism's tools was education. And some people think, well, tools are neutral. What I would argue is that some tools were specifically designed to colonize and destroy people. And schools were one of those tools. So it's not enough just to think, it's about education. It just had the wrong people in them, had the wrong churches, they had the wrong policies. It's about understanding actually that was a deliberate tool used to destroy families, children, destroy lives, destroy cultures. And so when we're working with those tools, we kind of really have to think, is this the tool I need to use, or do I need to kind of redesign, rebuild, and look for a different kind of tool, a different understanding, for example, of what education could be, different understanding of what the institution of schooling might be, and not just kind of add on to the history of the institution that we have inherited from that period of colonialism. So I'm talking about these as conceptual tools, and they're very powerful ideas, but they're often the very ideas that we take for granted. Now, I'm assuming you've read at least one of the editions of Decolonizing Methodologies, and you will be familiar with the idea of projects, of the 25 projects that were in the first edition. It's now in the third edition. It's the yellow book. I've added a whole new chapter with new projects because I did ask at many sort of conferences what people thought about those 25 projects and about whether I needed to change them. And I had workshops of graduate students coming up with new ideas or, working with the ideas of those 25 projects. What it all boiled down to is people liked the 25 projects and thought they were still relevant, but there were new projects, they're new priorities. And I just want to talk a little bit about, I think, how I identified those projects, because in a sense, if you come to some things theoretically, you can end up in a quite different place, abstract place, from if you come to it from an on-the-ground practice experience. And I think our work, often in research and theory, is how do we bring those ideas together. So the way I looked at identifying projects was to really observe and be engaged in where Indigenous communities, where I saw them actually putting their energy, their real life energy. So, you could read the literature and it would say, well, these are the things that are important, and this is, this is the problem of Indigenous peoples, and this is how they can fix themselves up, or this is how the state will fix them up. Whereas if you went out and you asked yourself, what are Indigenous people actually doing with their time? What are they spending their time on? And it was things like trying to get human remains and artifacts back from museums. It was trying to revitalise their languages. It was sending people to the UN to argue for their rights. It was being engaged in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was trying to save their waterways. And so that's really how I began to think about these projects as actually practical projects on the ground, where people were doing things counterintuitively often to, what the theory of colonialism and decolonization might argue, which is, about revolution or about redesigning the state and redesigning institutions. For those people attending to their gardens, trying to bring back their languages, that was their decolonizing project. And that was the method that they were using, or the approaches that they were using to kind of bring to the surface, to reinvigorate, invest with new life, this different knowledge system, this different way of understanding. And when I looked at, communities really all around the world, that's what I saw, that they hadn't given up. And it wasn't just about being resilient. They weren't just like surviving. They were being very purposeful. These were really important activities that said a lot about who they were and who they were trying to be, and the ideas that connected all those things. So that's how those kind of projects came about. And I think if you look at the new edition, it has these other projects, which I think the first one in the new chapter I've simply called Loving, to love each other, to love being Indigenous. And you might think, well, that's a rather romantic idea. Why would you think of that as a methodology? I've always thought of it really as an approach and as a method and as a politics, as a strategy, if you like, that for our peoples to thrive and survive. It's not just about fighting. It's It's not just about the sense of every day as a struggle, because you kind of want to live with the values that are based on ideas like love, not Western ideas, but your ideas of how do we care for each other, how do we exercise compassion, how do we, what motivates us to care for the earth, how deep do those ideas and philosophies go. And, the more I've got on with my career, whether as a teacher, administrator or researcher, I actually think loving is a really cool practice. It's something that universities are good at training us out of, actually, because there's this divorce between things which are seen as rationalism and intellectual development and ideas and logic and arguments, which all up here, right? They're all headspace, as opposed to practice space, which to me is why love is important. It's not just passion for what we do, it's in our relationships being able to demonstrate love. It's being motivated by this kind of understanding. And I'm not talking about romantic love, but sometimes there is some romance in the work that we do, and it's kind of acknowledging that as well. So there are some new ideas, I think, to think about in your own research about the work that how you might want to frame your research in a decolonizing way. And I think it's really important not to start necessarily with where you want to, or just, your intentions. It's also about thinking ahead to the potential outcomes that you want. So, when I'm working with my students, I like the big picture. I like the idea of where it's going to go and have some ideas about that. And then to sort of come backwards and start to rebuild or build a particular kind of project. I think we can't go into research these days just having good intentions, because researchers are good at good intentions. We're not that good at taking responsibility when those intentions don't work, and those intentions get in the way of actually being real about what we're doing and understanding the circumstances of the communities that we might be working with. So those are all issues that, I try and get my students to think through as they're developing their research ideas. To me, you can be doing a decolonizing approach, but it might be something like, let's see, cooking food, looking at the way that food itself and cooking a meal and preparing particular dishes and understanding the sources of the food that goes in there, understanding the philosophy of food, of why, in my culture, there's always a blessing. And I know in other Indigenous cultures, what is that about? And it's not just about going to a restaurant and eating exotic food. It's the practice and the way food is connected to a belief system. Hang on, I just got to do one thing. I just have to mute myself for 1 minute. Sorry, just got interrupted to move my car. Anyway, maybe I'll just take a pause there because now my thoughts got that way, and invite some commentary and questions. I'm happy to look at things, Louine, that are in the chat box, or you might want to facilitate.
Yes.
And I'll think about where my car keys are.
Okay. Yes, so we'll take questions. So just raise your hand. I see Maria already raise her hand. So raise your hand, and then I'll just say your name, and then you can unmute yourself. So yeah, Maria, if you want to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Smith. This has been such a pleasure listening to you. And I wanted to ask about how we tend to, when we start talking about this, we tend to focus on the knowing aspect, because that's really part of, the sort of organization, the industry we're part of. I also often wonder if part of our endeavor should be around the doing and the being also, right? And so, where there's liberal institutions, there's this attempt to bridge the knowing and the doing, but there's so little focus on the being, the embodiment piece of it. And I really wonder if we should be, instead of the business of knowledge, whether we should be in the business of wisdom.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I mean, I do think it's about the being. And often, I mean, that's where Western philosophy's categories become a major problem, because they divide things around epistemology, ontology, tautology, the ologies. Whereas in my own culture, knowledge is about being. It's knowing and being. There is objective knowledge out there, and the environment is one area where, our peoples have hundreds of years of experience and empirical knowledge of how things work. But then ultimately it's about well-being. It's understanding balance, harmony of humans in our environments, and the responsibility of humans, that sort of ethics approach. I think Brian Brayboy, who's a Native American, sort of talks about the axiology part of it. But I find those terms, epistemology, ontology, just not the right, they're not the right philosophical terms that describe, I think, Indigenous philosophy, where we're more inclined to talk about things like relationality, right? Everything is relational. Things are about knowing and being. You talk about wisdom. We have, deep understandings of what wisdom means in our cultures, and it's why our elders are considered, really, really important and have high status in terms of their life's wisdom. Doesn't mean to say that I don't think young people, don't have wisdom and can't gain it as a young person, but wisdom comes with things other than just being clever and just having a lot of experience. It comes with a kind of knowingness and the sense of being. So those are great comments. I agree totally with you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful answer. We can take another question from Kevin. You can unmute yourself.
All right, thanks, Louie. I'll just put my video on here shortly so you can see my beautiful face. I thought the commentary about linguistic uncertainties was especially interesting and relevant, something we've been going through in a lot of our classes. And just on that topic, you mentioned how education in the context of residential schools is sort of a tool. And I think that calling it a tool kind of implies intent. And I'm wondering if the intent was the ultimate outcome that we're all familiar with, destroying lives, families, and culture. And it's hard to know sort of the true intent of the federal government and the Catholic Church at the time. But do we know the true intent, or what was the government saying at the time that really allowed for broader public and political support of residential schools that made very few people oppose such a cultural genocide? Is it a side effect of groupthink, which for anyone who's not familiar is sort of a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment results from in-group pressures? And that sort of brings me to the question, what other factors, psychological phenomena, biases, or ulterior motives were at play? And is that important?
Thank you, Kevin. It is good to see your beautiful face. So I think if you look at the early policies for the education of Indian children, that kind of partly began in the US, and then obviously in terms of the military, the role of the military, and then the role of church dominations. You know, most historians would take you back to the doctrines of discovery, where the intent is, you know, ultimately the Indigenous peoples don't count and don't deserve their land, and that Europeans had the right to take land from non-Christian people. So there were big debates about that. But when it came to educational policy, whether it was in Canada, the US, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, those countries in particular, the early intents were very clear, very transparent. You know, it was about cultural, you know, destruction, cultural assimilation, you know, those ideas, breaking down the power of the family, breaking down the power of language, breaking down the power of even mothers, for example, Native mothers. So early policies for schooling for Indigenous children was like in your face racist. Did all teachers exercise that? I can't speak for Canada, but I know in New Zealand, in the early days, there were teachers who were, as far as the communities were concerned, were excellent, that cared for them, learned our language and spoke our language. Then there were teachers who weren't really trained at all. There were a lot of ex-soldiers, for example, who had been in India, who had come to New Zealand to fight our peoples and who became teachers. And some of them were sadistic and just awful. You know, I've read the archives of my own community school, and there were, you know, there was definitely a sadistic principle there that the community had to work hard to get rid of. There were also good teachers. Individuals, you know, can always mediate policy, but early policies, I think, were very deliberate. And then over time, they got glossed over as people thought, you know, this is the way you do things, but deeply embedded with this kind of sense that Indigenous people didn't deserve good things, didn't deserve the best options, that there was something internally wrong with them, that they had to be changed, that the role of education was to force them to change, even if they chose, you know, or expressed another view. So I think if you go into some of those histories, you'd be pretty shocked. You know, even in this New Zealand sense, which came later, a couple of 100 years later than Canada, it's fairly shocking what some of those early views about the education of Māori children was.
Thank you for the answer. It's good.
Thank you very much. Is it okay with your car, or do you want to continue?
My husband found the keys. I have no idea where he's moved the car. Now outside is a truck of dirt that's arrived to do some gardening.
Okay, okay, okay. Then if it's okay, we can, do you want to continue? We can take more questions. I do have a few questions myself.
Well, I'm happy to make this part more interactive. You know, I tend to give full answers to people, and in that, you know, hopefully it answers other people's questions. So if there are more questions, I'm happy to continue that way.
Okay, so while we wait for other people to raise their hands, and feel free to do so. So we have, so I have a question because, so between the first edition of the Decolonizing Methodologies books, so in 1999, so that's about 20 or so years ago. And I guess when when you reflect back into how the landscape academically has changed, or is it, or has it changed? So kind of, how do you feel that enough have been done since then until now? Or like we are really far away from anything really?
Good question. You know, when the book first came out, I think I know Indigenous people were, you know, reading it, but there was no field called Indigenous Studies. There were hardly any Indigenous scholars. There were hardly any people teaching research using those sorts of ideas. In fact, I don't think there were any. So it's, you know, the book itself has developed, and I think it's helped develop field of critical Indigenous studies, helped to kind of build the ideas around critical research methodologies, expand maybe some of the ideas that are in qualitative research in particular, and it's influenced specific fields. But I feel that while it's been bubbling along in terms of Indigenous and communities of colour, for want of a, you know, better term, it's taken on a new life over the last few years. Like, I get more invitations to speak in England, and I found that really curious, like, why now? I mean, the book's been out for ages, but it's like they've just discovered, you know, ideas around decolonialism, and part of that is because of the work of Black scholars and others who've really been challenging the, you know, academic foundations of universities. So the Rhodes Must Fall campaign that came out of South Africa, and, you know, many of those scholars have really challenged Oxford, Cambridge, and, you know, those traditions that have held up really, you know, colonialists, people who did huge damage to other cultures, and they are honoured in Britain, and they're honoured in those institutions. So that tells me that, you know, the book has taken a long time to maybe filter out, and it's got new audiences who are not necessarily Indigenous audiences, but people engaging with these ideas in their context, wanting to understand a lot more about the traditions that they're using in their research and their knowledge, and also questioning really the tenets of the societies that they, and the institutions that they're part of. I think that's a different audience than the, you know, the ones I'm used to talking to, who are mostly Indigenous.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Kelsey, whoops.
What the hell? Wait a minute, sorry. I can't even turn that off. Yep, sorry about that.
No problem. If anyone doesn't want to maybe raise their hand and talk, you can write your question in the chat and we'll be monitoring and ask your questions. So Kelsey, if you want to come in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Smith, for being here with us in this virtual space today and sharing all of your wealth of knowledge and wisdom with our community. I guess I wanted to ask you, firstly, do you envision future editions of Decolonizing Methodologies? In relation to that question is, any commentary or feedback or thought you might have on the potential spaces of co-optation that have occurred and sort of the phrasing of decolonization, right? Decolonize the academy, decolonize syllabi, all of the sort of iterations that have emerged in recent years is sort of the part two of that question. And I guess the third portion of this larger question is where your research is taking you now. You wrote this text almost 2 decades ago, and probably it took you a while even before that to put it all together. So I'm just curious to see where you find yourself now in this portion of your life, and even after the hashtag because of Linda.
Thank you for that. So the book's had 3 editions, and each time it's like, I don't really want to do another edition. It's really hard to go back to something you've written. I don't know if you've had to do that, Louine, but it's really hard to go back and kind of think, oh, what can I add? Well, what shall I do now? Because the tendency is to completely rewrite it. And, the publisher said, no, you just, add a new introduction, think about what's happened since. This 3rd edition was a little bit more dramatic than in terms of changes than the 2nd one, but I don't envision doing another edition. I think definitely things are evolving, but there's so many more authors out there now. All of you, if you all publish a paper, that contributes to this field. So I also write in the field of education, and although lately my life is about mostly writing emails and instructions to students and things like that. So that's that part of your question. But you had another part of your question.
On co-optation of decolonizing.
Yeah. That is a major issue. And I know people like Eve Tuck have written, about, I guess that side of decolonizing. That's why I think words are really important in my understanding what decolonizing might mean, because people can set off thinking that they're decolonizing and it'll end up being a total mess and we'll just go back to what we have. In fact, we are living in a time where white supremacy is rising, where attacks on notions such as decolonizing, notions of racism and that are being amplified, partly out of Trump, but also, look at what's been happening around the pandemic. All these weird forces are coming together. And I think decolonizing work is actually quite subtle work. So if you're thinking about the curriculum, you're thinking about institutions, it's not simply taking away. It is about what are we building? What are the new things that we are constructing and inventing and creating that are, not about decolonizing something that's already exists, but about building something new that is not weighed down by, you know, racist ideas, for example, or colonial ideas. There is, I mean, a lot of sort of people who think they're contributing to a decolonial agenda, but are not in it for the long term. And, you know, you can just replace that idea with maybe what's going on in the anti-racism space. You know, people have been working in anti-racism for decades and decades. And sometimes we have gains, we win things, and then other times those get taken over. It's interesting the number of people who are like, you know, adventurers, if you like. They go in thinking this is the thing, this is the wave that they're going to ride, but they have no clues whatsoever. They end up doing a lot more damage. And my worry is, you know, if I were in the political spectrum, that the decolonizing aspects is just a fad. They'll do some changes. They'll do land acknowledgements, maybe. They'll change a few things in curriculum. They'll, you know, introduce better, richer equity things, and then that'll be it. And white supremacy will still be in charge. You know, so the thing with decolonizing is ultimately you're looking at different power structures, and it's fairly the vision, if you like, is a different system. In order to create a different system, we all have to help design that system, because it doesn't currently exist. And none of us really know exactly what it must look like. It has to come from all of us building it together. And that means great allies, or as my Australian colleagues say, great accomplices. We have to help each other build this. And it has to have certain features that don't currently exist. But it's a huge project that requires grounded practice and knowledge, that doing part, but also understanding that as you go forward, as you do this, you have to practice the very values that you think are important. Because, you know, we've had decolonialism in post World War II, in terms of the role of the United Nations in ensuring that colonial states had the right to exercise and become independent. That was one version of decolonization. And we know from that history that it can go terribly wrong, that it can be a very violent process, that in the end, nothing changes. The people who are in power might change, but some deep structures stay the same. The economy stays the same. Land ownership stays the same. Social class stays the same. And so we know from past experience that to change all those things is a multi-generational task now. You know, how do you change capitalism?
Thank you. That's a $1 million question. How do you change capitalism? Don't think anyone has. I guess there are some answers, but are we willing to implement them? We have 2 more hands. So Liliana, if you want to come in.
Thanks, Louine. Thank you, Dr. Smith. This is so interesting. I really enjoyed your book, and it also challenged me in particular when you talk about representation and reinterpretation of ideas as researchers as a form of colonialism. And so my struggle is, although, so the research that I'm planning to do is using a methodology that it's granted theory. It uses my kind of research communities, like the community's words to help to interpret meaning. And there is some element of co-creation of meaning and co-interpretation that I'll do. But then I'm also in this position as a PhD student where I have bounds around time and bounds around resources. And I'm particularly aware that the community I'm doing research with is not my own. Like, I don't live there. I'm not a member of the community. So I suppose the question is, like, how would you recommend that a student who wants to be as I don't know what the word is, decolonialized as possible, but like is working within these boundaries, like how do we approach the research and how do we create something that is not just like not a poor attempt and but inadvertently just kind of recreates what our universities have historically been set up to do. Thanks.
So when you're a student and you're learning, so don't think you have to have all the answers and do it perfectly. I think what you're doing is something that gives you the opportunity to try things out. And there's nothing wrong with having constraints and some tight rules. So your first task is to complete your research and complete your dissertation. And that means doing something that is feasible and within your reach, where you can try certain ideas out, but maybe not the full suite. It might be just one that helps you think through, a particular approach or topic that you are trying to deal with. I don't know what level you're at, but if you're working at a community with a community that's not your own, doesn't matter what the topic is, that's already hard. All right, you already have a number of issues there that would be substantive stuff that you're going to have to deal with. I heard Louise say earlier, that you've been working on positionality. Well, even if you are Indigenous and working in an Indigenous community, positionality matters. If you're a, Maori woman like me working with other Maori women, positionality matters. It's not just about white people working in black and brown communities. All of us as researchers need to understand ourselves, and because we need to understand the impact that we make, often naively when we're students, in our research. And you can think of that impact as negative. And when I was trained, it was the fly on the wall approach. And I remember a member of the team I was part of, it was in the health area, in the asthma area. He said, Linda, you need to think of yourself as a fly on the wall. And I looked at him and thought, well, number one, I'm not a fly. And number two, I ain't sticking on a wall. I know these people. I know these. I know what's going on in their homes. I know what they did to tidy up before I arrived. So we had this kind of tension about how I should conduct myself as a researcher. But I buckled down. I had to do what I had to do as part of a project, but I kept learning, kept thinking about these ideas, kept watching, observing. I was interviewing all kinds of families and Pacific Island families, Indigenous Māori families, middle-class white families, police families, in the police force. A lot of the children I was, meeting in hospitals with asthma came from families where someone had a high-stress job. So, that work informed my PhD, but my PhD wasn't about that per se. But while you're a student, use the opportunity to learn, observe, think, learn, and really, learn here with your eyes and your mind, but learn with your heart.
Thank you very much. We have Ainu. I hope I'm sure I butchered your name. I'm sorry. But
No
yes,
worries.
please.
Hi, it's Ainur.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Smith. It's always an amazing talk. I love your book and I love your talks. And I'm teaching decolonizing methodology to my students and really encourage them to think a lot about this complexity of research and what's regarded as research historically and how they could approach research with different kind of mindset. And your book been tremendous help. And I also encourage students to think a lot about their lived experience, their personal commitment, and their emotional labor that they chose a topic to dedicate themselves for years, and how they could bring that wealth of information and experience to their research. But many times, still never stop surprised by them. They always so worried about, like, if I bring my lived experience, if I bring my emotional, what if my research is not objective enough? Like, how do I converge the data of interviewing or collecting the online materials with my own set of positionality and lived experience? So, and then I kind of encourage them. That's the whole idea of decolonizing methodology. Could you please, am I getting it wrong, or if you could expand that more on that, I would really appreciate.
Yeah. So I think, in the area of most critical approaches would argue that there's no such thing as objectivity, that really our task is to be transparent about where we're coming from. That's why positionality matters, because then people read what you write in relation to what you've stated around your positionality. The question of experience is really interesting, and I've been rethinking it at the moment, in the sense, so firstly, lived experience is absolutely important, and we all have lived experience, not just some, but it's lived experience of what? And what does lived experience give you access to? What does it entitle you to? What does it, provide? What kind of tools does that provide you with? The reason I'm rethinking it is, I'm working in a couple of areas in trauma. So some of my most recent research has been about trauma-informed care and working with community providers in a partnership. So from the community of clients, if you like, there's this call that people in positions of influence and authority in these spaces have lived experience. So this is this is an example. Yeah. All right. In principle, yes, But then in working with these many provider groups, it's also pretty clear that for many practitioners, clinicians, their own trauma, so they have lived experience, but they relive their trauma through healing or ostensibly trying to heal the trauma of others. So it's a little kind of niggle I have about trying to figure that piece out. That they don't think they're doing that, but as someone who comes in like I do, kind of in and out, who listens to them, who interviews them, I can hear a bit of that, and I worry about it. I wonder about it, if you like, that there are limits to lived experience. That, you know, so what we're saying, for example, in our research is, you know, providers need to make sure that they heal themselves, that they run the kinds of professional development programs that ensure their staff are also in the healing domain, that they are aware of what they're doing. And, you know, and that is not necessarily good for some clients to be cared for or treated by, you know, someone who is also in trauma. I mean, it's a tricky issue because, you know, I'm Indigenous and I had an academic life, and you think, well, everyone in academia is kind of sorted, they don't have issues. Well, that's a big fat lie. You know, they do have issues, and many of them are traumatized, and then they exercise that trauma on students. So universities aren't healthy places either. And I just think we need to always come back to these key ideas and tenets and rethink them. So I'm doing some rethinking about that at the moment. I don't have an easy answer. I think being transparent matters, positionality matters, being in community matters, having colleagues who question you matters, having a continuously inquiring mind matters, picking up on little concerns and working them, that matters. You know, being constantly attentive in your research to what you're seeing. Don't take it for granted. Like, just because we say, well, you know, we're into lived experience, never take those things for granted. Always question them, because once they don't work, you've got to abandon them.
Thank you very much.
You see the limits. You know, everything has limits, right?
Thank you. I'm just, so we're going to take one last question because I'm just being cognizant of the time. So I don't know who is a serious user. Who are you?
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm a PhD student with CERS. Thank you very much for the talk. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed your introduction, and I'll try to pick up on a couple of things that you said and ask a few different questions. So I really liked, your point about, this idea of obliterating other knowledges through this kind of, through these binary positions and creating these kind of oppositional categories. And I liked the point that you were making, or the question that you raised about, do we dismantle everything? And does it mean, sort of untangling what we have? And then I think Kelsey Leonard asked a question about, co-option of, I suppose, this idea of decolonization. And I think, and so picking up on that, I think my first question is, knowledge, it's a trajectory, it's not static. And I think, in a westernized approach to decolonization, I think there's, potentially a risk of treating Indigenous knowledges as static, or looking back to sort of post-colonial traditions and trying to sort of hold on to them in a rigid way. And another question that I have, sort of adjacent to that would be, like what would the trajectory have been? What would Indigenous cultures and knowledges have looked like had colonization not occurred? And what would the process of integration between, sort of Indigenous knowledges and other types of knowledge have looked like at that time? What would a normal trajectory of development, or a sort of a more equitable trajectory of development at an earlier stage, have looked like?
Ooh, those are good questions. I'm not sure if I can answer them really well. I'll answer them a little bit maybe from a different angle. So here in New Zealand, Mātauranga Māori, or Māori knowledge, is now something that all applications for government-funded research has to address. And there's a whole policy around Māori knowledge in our science policies and in the funding of research. And many of our scientists, if you like, are being challenged to include, particularly, around climate science, environmental science, but even in the abstract sort of physics type realm, they've got to think about the impact of their research on Māori. They've got to think about the building of Māori capacity, and they've got to think about whether there's a potential for Māori knowledge to be included in their project. Now, when that policy first came in, I used to be on assessing committees, and all the scientists would say they'd tick the box which said that Māori had no relevance. But over time, that box has been removed, and everyone has to fill out that assessment. The impact of that has been this kind of growth of amazing research in which science or disciplines and Māori knowledge are being included together in particular projects. So just some practical examples of ones I'm involved in right now. So I'm involved in one looking at a harbour, and the tribe, it's been led by a collaboration of tribal organisations who have chosen Māori scientists, and who basically signal to non-Māori scientists that unless you can work with Māori knowledge, we don't want you in our spaces. And then the other part of their research team are tribal experts in whether it's in the forestry, in the waterways, in fishing, those sorts of fields. And we're working together on this big collaboration. So one of the interesting things is, scientists are trained to look at this one, say, fish and its environment and what causes it to disappear or come back. Māori scientists or Māori people look at who's that, who's all the relations, what's the family of that fish? Who are its plant relations? Who should it go with? Like when it's thriving, what else in the environment is thriving? What does it need? And so you've got these completely different ways of coming together. And so tomorrow we spend the entire day in this, what we call a wānanga, a thinking space to try and just finalise our project. There are projects happening like that all over New Zealand. So, that's the come out of 30, 40 years of policy development, trying to have Māori knowledge work in relation to Western knowledge, Western kind of disciplines. Interestingly, it's happening more in the sciencey area than it is in the social science and humanities area. So, people tend to think, the humanities, they're soft and that. Well, to be quite honest, they're often more racist than the sciences in terms of the way they uphold particular tenets of knowledge. Same as in the creative arts. I mean, I think all academic disciplines need decolonizing. There are none that are softer than others. Even those that talk about race and racism, like sociology, for example, are not necessarily purer than maybe a biological scientist who spends their life working in a particular environment. So that's the present, but you're asking about, how it worked in the past. Well, I don't think it really worked in the past. I think it was entirely exploitative. One of the interesting things in New Zealand is many of the early missionaries and travellers who came here were interested in what Maori knew. And so there's a lot of written material about Maori knowledge and about the things that Maori people knew. But remember, I'm talking about the 1800s, whereas for Canada, you've got to go back probably a couple of hundred years. It's got a longer history of colonialism than here in New Zealand. I don't know if that sufficiently helps, but it's a work in progress. There may be some areas where it works well together, the different knowledges, and then there's some areas which I know our people don't want to share. It's not public knowledge. It's not really, they don't want to get into any kind of collaboration. We're just trying to revitalize it. And then there's some knowledge which our people have set aside. They've actually said, we're changing. Because, you talked about static, the idea of static, and that's why I don't like the term traditional, because it implies static knowledge. Whereas I think Indigenous people have continued to build knowledge. I think we're one of the most knowledgeable groups in society about how colonialism worked, about colonization, about exploitation, all those sorts of ideas. We have a lot of knowledge about, not just experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have also 10,000 questions, but the time, I don't want to take too much of your time. So unless there are any other pressing questions, we're going to wrap up. Professor Smith, I don't know if you have any final words of wisdom you would like to share with us. I don't know.
No, no final words, and definitely not words of wisdom. I just apologize for the interruptions in my life, but the keys and not being able to get on early, and but that's life. And I've enjoyed, one of the positives, if you like, of being able to be in a virtual space is here I am in Aotearoa, New Zealand, being able to talk to you in the Caribbean and other people in Canada. And I just hope everyone that you're looking after yourselves, taking care of yourselves, being good in a loving way.
We try. It's a hard way to go, but we try to do it. Yeah. But thank you a lot for your time. For the kind of mixed up that was earlier the talk, but we managed to be there. So thank you a lot. Before we wrap up, so this was our final session. So I thank you, Professor Smith. Also thanks the audience for coming. So we are on reading week today, so thanks everyone for leaving their vacation and coming. So we have been recording the talks. It will be available on the Environment Faculty YouTube channel. So we'll share the link once it's available. So just one final word. So building on this experience, we we are offering a little e-course on decolonizing methodologies for sustainability research, because we just try to put together everything that the speakers and all the things that we learned over this past year together, so that it's actually somewhere, a repository, so that people can come and just continue their learning journey. So the course will launch on March 3rd. If you want more information, just don't hesitate to contact us at STEC, or me or Madhu or Sarah. Just contact us, but we'll send more information later this week. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Smith. And yeah, we'll keep in touch for sure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.